Welcome to Church Planting and Renewal Conversations. I'm Chris Vogel, Director of Next Gen Pastors, and serve M&A as the Director of Ecosystem Development. Presbyterians don't have patron saints unless you're a Calvin and Hodge fan. But if we did, we'd probably nominate Patrick to be our patron saint of church planters. As today is St. Patrick's Day, before you raise your pint of green beer, let's talk Patrick as a church planter. As you may recall, Patrick was a British Roman citizen, kidnapped at 16 and enslaved for 6 years in Ireland. After escaping back to Britain, it took him almost 20 years to return, having been trained in Britain and France. And some sources say his first request to be a missionary was turned down. For those who have struggled through the assessment center or other assessing processes for church planting, you're in good company. But they've said that in the 5th century, it's reported that Patrick planted more than 200 churches and 100,000 people profess faith in Christ. None of that takes place without training. When it comes to planting and pastoring, there are 3 C's that are quite critical: call, character, and competency. To become competent, training is vital. Training is our topic today with regard to church planting. There's no specified exact way in which training should take place, but there are opportunities to be equipped to be a more competent planter. With us today are 2 guests who have been involved in training and equipping planters for decades and can speak to call and character, and for today, competency. With us is Tim Rice, who's planted Trinity Presbyterian Church in Lakeland, Florida in 1997. And he's been involved in the training and multiplying of church planters ever since. Trinity daughtered several churches and has helped to raise up planters over the last 20 years. Ted Powers is no stranger either to church planting. Ted currently serves as the Director of Midwest Alliance, helping to resource and coordinate church planting for the Midwest region of the PCA. He has served for many years as church planting coordinator for M&A, where he was involved in identifying, assessing, training, and coaching church planters and working with other M&A staff, church planting leaders, network directors to provide vision and catalytic leadership for church planting in the PCA. Well, before we jump in, let me start off by saying, as always, this is meant to be a conversation. So if you're attending with us, we invite you to engage by asking questions using the chat box or the Q&A feature. That's here on Zoom. If you're watching on Facebook, it will be a challenge for us to track those questions, and we'll do our best. But please engage, throw some questions or situations that is of interest to you. All right. Well, again, welcome, Ted and Tim. I want to just start off by, asking this question when it comes to training. When someone graduates seminary, they're licensed, they'll do an internship for their ordination, they get a call, they're ordained, they get busy in the church doing the job, and then someone says, I want to be a church planter. And then they get assessed. We tell them to get a coach and get some more training. Why is that? If I've been already ordained, what is the value, the benefit, the necessity of training when it comes to church planting?
Lead off, buddy.
Do you want me to go, Ted, or you?
Go right ahead.
I would say the shortest answer I can think of is that the stakes are higher because of what's involved with launching a church, the raising of money, the risk, the you're dangling out there for people to gather to, and that is such a high risk venture. It's specialized. Then there's no support. You don't have, especially the more closer you are to a parachute drop or a start from scratch church, you don't have the infrastructure, pre-existing relationships, a building, a programs, a community identity. So you're doing something higher risk with lower support. That's a prime place to say, I need to stay living in the training mindset all my days.
Yeah, and I would concur with that. I think also, at least my experience, seminary and a lot of the training we get has really generally prepared people for parish ministry. It is not really focused very much on, I guess, what you might call the mission field. So at least historically, we've been really good at preparing men to preach in an established church, shepherd, run ministries, disciple, that kind of thing. But we've not generally provided much in the area of missionaries and evangelists, how to start something new from nothing, and everything that's involved in networking and gathering, let alone generating the finances, and even how to structure every day. I mean, one of the things that will throw a church planter, for example, is that in regular ministry, I guess you might say, regular church ministry, you'll wake up every day and there's more to do than than you can get to. There's sermons to prepare and meetings to attend and people to see and shepherd and just any number of things. And so that's the challenge. Where in church planning, you might wake up in those initial days and say, what am I going to do today? So you really have to generate every single day in those initial, and that really can throw people off. So it's a totally different context, it's a totally different dynamic that the majority of people just are not trained for.
So what are the types of things? You mentioned some of them. You've said a missionary mindset. You talk about getting something started, evangelism. Let's talk a little bit more about, so what are some of those other skills, and maybe getting a bit more even specific what that might mean or look like?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think part of it, you've got to have a certain temperament, mindset, or disposition personally that you are comfortable with the work of gathering. And that's one of the things we are often looking at in terms of assessment. If that's not in there, you probably ought not to be doing church planting. I would delineate between those who can shepherd or manage people that have already been gathered, in contrast with the people, the person or people that can gather people that have not yet been collected. But that's the end of the spectrum where all church planting starts. And so you have to ask, if I have the disposition for that, there still might be some training I could get in terms of skills and competencies, just creativity, or just a mindfulness of what it means to think like, work like, and even structure my calendar, like Ted is saying, to structure my calendar and time around activities of gathering.
Yeah, and that networking and gathering component really is so significant. And with that, just unique leadership skills that are required for that. The ability to cast vision and to engender sort of a confidence in other people about where you're going and how we're going to get there. Essentially, in a church plant, people that you meet are going to ask two questions. First question that people are asking is, does this guy know where he's going? Yeah. And the second question they're going to ask, do I think he can get us there? And those are leadership capacities. And especially when you really don't have a building to point to or established ministries that you can involve, you don't have a full service church with youth ministries and everything else, you have to be able to cast a vision. And I got asked all the time, so where does your church right now? I'd say, well, it's right here. Yeah. That's all I got. But I can paint a picture for you. And this is where we're going. This is our destination. And then people would decide if that was something they wanted. Did they think you could get us there? So those leadership capacities are really significant. Now, obviously under the COVID conditions, networking and gathering is a whole new challenge, but it is being done. And you can actually end up making a lot of connections in a community. The challenge is gathering them together.
Yeah. What have you seen that planters have learned in this last year? Mm-hmm. So you're doing training, and the first thing is getting a presence and starting to gather. Mm-hmm. None of us have been trained for or did any training for planters in the context of a pandemic. Yeah. But there have been lessons learned. So, and Steve mentions this on one of the attendees. Throw COVID in there, gets even harder. Yeah, it does. So, what might you, in addition, say in light of COVID that we've learned that is a lesson that can continue on for gathering?
Right. Well, first off, you mentioned character, Chris, along with what Ted was talking about in terms of competencies, and I think that's where the character piece becomes all the more significant when people are asking, do I believe you can get me there? Mm. I know you articulate vision, but do you have something that cultivates that sense of engenders trust, confidence? And I think that's where that character piece comes in. And this has been a season of testing that I think reveals that. Some men, I think a lot of us have been had to face hard questions of, just how solid is my character in this time when you strip away the external props. You cannot gather. Do we have a church? Do we have a vision? Do we have a mechanism? And then creatively, can we respond to these circumstances and still get our work done? The men I work with that I've trained will, if they're online, a couple of them they'll laugh and smile to themselves because I talk about military thinking all the time. Especially now, it's guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare has prevailed for thousands of years against super established superpowers. But what they had tenacity. They had a long view. They had a very long view that we're going to outlast these invaders, these oppressors. For you go from Afghanistan hundreds of years ago, or even thousands of years ago, to China, to Vietnam, to today in Afghanistan. Do we believe we can outlast the oppressive forces of darkness in our culture? And we're going to keep doing what we're doing because we're committed to it. And I think this is a season that tests that.
Right. And it is really challenging. And it sounds so basic, so almost embarrassing to say it. But one of the things I think it's done for planters is really, truly driven them to their knees in prayer.
Absolutely.
I think we believe in that. I think we always have in that regard. But we really will then stay in the back of my mind. It really depends on all the connections I'm making in the community and how hard I work and all these other sort of things. And that's true. It is all that. But what the element that has gotten more emphasized is prayers, to say, God, it's always been this way, but now it's more evident. Unless you do this, nothing's going to work. I don't know where I'm going to make connections. I don't know how I'm going to find a place to get people to meet, all that kind of thing. And so I think it's really made prayer so much front and center. And I'll just use an example in Springfield, Illinois. Stephen Lawrence. He's done what probably most of us would not advise doing. Moved there during COVID, a scratch church plant, and then start networking, start meeting people. It's like, why would you do that under these conditions? But he has. And God has just opened up door after door after door of connections in that community. He's just a few months in, but he had his first vision night just a couple weeks ago because somebody that he met said, hey, you can use our restaurant. Go ahead and meet. And we'll have free ice cream for everybody who comes, that kind of thing. And the kids can be in this room. The adults can be over here. And he had 35 adults at his first vision night, but that was from scratch. And so it's like, God is still saying to us, the gates of hell or a pandemic or whatever, I can handle that. Yes, it's way more challenging. Characters really come to the fore. Prayer has to be more intense than ever, but God still is doing it. I'm just seeing the evidence of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. Well, now listen, in the broadest picture then, when we're talking about training, how would you divide training up if you were to train someone? What's the scope and sequence that you think is important? What should be touched on for a planter to be aware of?
Oh gosh,
there's a lot there, man.
Go, Ted. You go first.
Well, maybe I could.
We only have 45 more minutes, so. Yeah,
right. There really is a lot. I think what we try to do now, at least what I'm trying to do here with what we do, we lay out what we call foundations in church planting. And so we have an initial seminar where we lay out this is really what you need to be thinking about and get the big picture and the immediate things to focus on. We'll give you the principles. We'll give you the key dynamics. These are lessons learned from years past from all of us, like Tim and me and everyone who's made every mistake you can think of, and yet God has proven to be gracious and sovereign over all of it. We do that, and then the real matter comes with coaching. That you've got to follow that up with coaching, because then coaching says, okay, you've just learned all these principles, you have all this information, but how is this going to translate into your context? Based on who you are, based on where you're at, and the particular circumstances and challenges that you're facing. And I think that's where the rubber meets the road. And so where we try to provide training now, instead of at a big conference where you get all the info and then try to remember what you learned years ago, you get what you need now. Then we're going to coach you until you reach the next significant stage, give you more info, coach you more, and so forth, right on down, and spread that over, let's say, a 3-year period. And I think that's already proven to be more effective for us.
Any thoughts along those lines, Tim?
Yeah, just agreement. It's just like, it's such a big question. It's like, I think of how we really do train along those C's you were talking about, that we are always thinking in terms, well, first off, gospel fluency. Our ground for, foundation work for everything is not just, is the gospel something you can articulate like a tract, a brochure? Do you have a living, breathing, thriving experience with Jesus and a present tense reality to that is launched from your justification by faith? You have had a definitive experience, but now it has given rise to an ongoing, growing, ever increasing intimacy that you need him, and you are doing ministry out of that cognizant awareness. You need Jesus. You're the biggest sinner in the room of anybody you're meeting with or doing work with. You're not a hero rescuing people. Jesus is the only hero. So I think that really probably goes with the calling piece, but it also ties into that character piece. Are you being personally transformed? And as we are training, what are you learning about your own character frailties? What are you seeing about the fault lines of your family of origin story? How are you learning how to apply the gospel to your own heart and life? Because how are you going to apply it to the heart and lives of others if you can't apply it to yourself? So that character piece, then the competencies and all those things, the tools we've used from Global Church Advancement and Steve Childers, the things we did in M&A, Ted, decades back, the things we're doing with Next Gen now. Shameless plug for Chris. The Next Gen resourcing is fantastic.
Right.
So then the one thing what I'm hearing there that's so critical is we're talking about training. It's not just acquiring a set skill that you plug in.
Right.
That's external to you. If it's not the internal working of the gospel, and there's nothing like church planting to put that right up in your face of your own failings and sinfulness. So we've got that as that ongoing foundation through it. So if I'm saying, okay, I'm just arrived at a presbytery, I'm new, I don't know the area all that well, there's not a core group, how should I think through the sequence of what I should be doing and where that training should be applied?
Well, I'd say
again, we mentioned gathering as part of that, and so what's the normal pattern that?
I think you normally think about several different stages. One would be preparation stage, and that's one a lot of people don't give a lot of attention to, and I think that's where a lot of problems actually start getting built into the planting process, because you haven't taken the time to really lay the right kind of groundwork, prepare the way for a church plant. And that whole preparation stage is just putting yourself in a position to do what you feel God has called you to do. It involves all sorts of things, from funding and budgeting and prayer teams and laying out initial vision and plans. Guys need some awareness about all of that before they're ever even going to get to the field. And so by the time they do move to a presbytery, to an area that they don't know, they actually have laid some kind of a framework in their lives about how am I going to be approaching this. And I think that's a step that a lot of people don't think about. They think I'll just get there and I'll start doing whatever I'm supposed to do.
What happens when that? What have you seen when that's not done well? What's the outcome?
I think a stunted plant, or one that doesn't make it at all.
Yeah, I think I agree with it. And it comes out mechanistic.
Yeah.
You are like you're just a distributor of packaging and product that somebody else produced.
That's well put. Yeah.
It's not organic. It's not, you're like a vending machine distributing food someone else grew, produced, packaged, and then you just collect money off of that process. You weren't a farmer growing the food, a chef cooking the food. That's a different feel. And I think there's a lot of church planting and even ministry in established churches that can really be that mechanistically I'm just there to deliver a product. I'm not really there experiencing Jesus personally. That's why I just put into the caption, the chat box, 2 Corinthians 1, am I comforted? Is God met me? Have I met him? And then out of that, I'm comforting others. Do I feel like this ministry thing is something I got to come up with, or am I really just out of the overflow of my own communion with Jesus? I'm just sharing freely out of what he's so freely given to me. So I think it's a different feel. I would say the paradigms of ministry have changed so profoundly with Christendom. I think Christendom's dead. And if people haven't awakened to that, well, wake up. But seminaries have been tooled for Christendom. They tooled us in a time where pastors were respected, churches were respected, not anymore. If you're under 30 and you tell somebody, oh, I lead a church, their most typical question would be like, why? Why that? You know, that the church has such little credibility. So I think the work used to be teach and then do some, lead some services and do a itty bitty bit of counseling, because most people really have their stuff together. And every now and then you have these few people need to be counseled. Now I think it's build relationships. That's the big giant work. And then under that is establish a credible life that these people I'm building relationships would want, that then I do an itty bitty amount of teaching, because they don't care what I have to say until I have a relationship with them and I have some credibility that I've established by how I live. And we collectively as a church plant, how do we live that is sparking some sense of credibility to these outsiders and non-Christians who want to have some understanding of the hope we have.
That's great. That's why even our training has had to change.
Yes.
I mean, initially, I think, Chris, when you went through training, I got through training, we actually had some notebooks that we could use. It was so much more plug and play.
Yeah.
We had a real business model for planting a church, and our time, raise funds, 3 years, do this sort of thing, and out will pop this church, kind of thing. And
I think I still have the cassette tapes in the church planners toolkit that I used. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was so much more plug and play. Now it's so much more organic. We've really had to get away from a business model that we've been so familiar with for years to a far more organic, relationally driven. And I think the kind of phrase that I like to throw around is that church planting, you don't think about that your main thing there is to get a Sunday morning event going, which a lot of people have typically thought of. I'm not successful until I have a Sunday morning event going. Right. But what church planting more and more is like missions on a mission field. And it's building relationships, and it's learning a culture, and it's doing ministry in people's lives, and then seeing if a church breaks out.
Yeah.
It's a lot more along those lines. And as you do that kind of discipling, maybe gathering some believers who need a church home, doing some evangelism, getting to know the area, and praying like crazy all as you go, that's a totally different dynamic. And that requires different kinds of training than we used to give. And with that, the imperative of coaching.
Yeah. Right. So we have the preparation, and it sounds like a lot of that can and even should be done before being on site.
Yes.
So getting all that together. So let's say I've spent the time, been working on that. What comes next?
Well, even if you're going to be networking and gathering and spending a couple of years at doing that, it's so much of learning the community, making those kind of relational connections with everybody from the community leadership to other pastors, other churches, connections that God just sovereignly gives you, to real estate agents, to principals and teachers in schools and fire chief, police chiefs, all these. I mean, it just goes on and on. But then so you're trying to help people understand, well, who are you going to meet in your community? Let's talk about your community. Who's there? Who do you need to meet? What questions do you want to ask them? How are you going to go about doing this? How are you then going to begin to identify people who might actually need your ministry, who are more than just helping you learn the community, but that you build a relationship with? God opens the door, gives you a sovereign connection. Now, what do you do with that? So you need some advanced training. So you know some of this. You have some tracks to run on, but then you're going to have to adjust as you go along, and that's where a coach can help you navigate that a little bit. But that's really where you start, and it's entirely a prayer-driven, relational ballgame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say one of the things that I used to love about Steve Childers used to ask this question of how well can you articulate the idols of your community and how those idols have caused the aspects of pain, dysfunction, suffering, oppression, whatever, and then how well can you answer those idols with the hope of the gospel, so that you show a community awareness that informs your gospel communication. And I used to love that about Childers. I thought that was a great insight.
And you just can't do that on the fly. You can't just walk into a community and begin to identify that.
And, which goes back to the long view. I think that we are an impatient society, and the idea that you're going to move to a community, this goes back to calling, to really consider what does it mean to say, okay, I'm not going to be here for 2 years. I might need to think about a 10-year minimum. I mean, just for realistic dynamics today.
That is the rule of thumb today, is 10 years to establish a church.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that kind of goes against, I think, what often has been felt, and I've heard from M&A committees is, well, in 3 years, you should be up and going and self-sufficient and running full steam.
I would say BC, before COVID.
Certainly that.
Well, when you start talking about a more organic way of planning churches, it generally means you need a longer runway as well. More time to build relationships. I mean, part of the problem with the 3-year model, that business model, as I would call it, is that you felt under the gun with finances running out. Mm-hmm. I had to gather believers just to pay the bills, if for no other reason, kind of thing. It didn't give me the time to really invest in evangelistic types of relationships, which of course takes so much longer, and they take longer and longer than ever before.
Yeah.
So if I'm going to do that, I need a longer time frame. I really need to have an incarnational ministry in the community. All of that takes longer, and that means even funding strategies need to change. Mm-hmm. Whether you're going to have long-term people funding you, or whether you have to start moving towards bivocational ministry. That's going to be important. We might even need to start thinking about things like, well, house churches and house church networks and things like that. That in many places, the traditional model of let's just get a church up and going, have 200 or 300 or 400 people, just isn't going to work in a lot of contexts. So you've got to figure out every time what's going to work. And that's one of the things I think is important to communicate in training. Here's some lessons learned and some key principles and all that kind of stuff. But every single church plant is a unique, custom designed work of the Holy Spirit. And it varies everywhere. You just cannot plug and play. You cannot say, hey, I like this. I love Trinity Lakeland, and we're going to do Trinity Lakeland over here. That probably ain't going to work, kind of thing. But if it's all you know, that's all you're going to do, unless you've gotten some training and some coaching.
So what are some of the other aspects of training, of doing the heart prep, the site prep? What else, if someone's moving towards planting a church or thinking about it, what other kinds of training should they be considering?
Well, one, Tim, you can chime in on this one, but I think preaching is one of the big ones, because again, we have been so trained to communicate to an established Christian audience. Mm-hmm. We are not very good in connecting with people in an effective, meaningful way from the pulpit with the unchurched person. And one of the remedies to that is to be out in the community meeting all sorts of unchurched people and in talking about things that are part of their lives. And as you prepare a message, you're thinking about these people and what will they think when they hear this message? What questions are they going to ask? What objections are they going to raise? How is this going to be received into their worldview and value system as I've gotten to know it? And that takes some time, and it takes some training and coaching. Yeah. So part of what I do with the coaching I do is I get guys to send me their messages. I'm going to get online and listen to some of them, because I don't think we're very good at doing that. For example, we'll often say, I preach gospel-centered sermons, and I'll listen to them and I'll say, you didn't do it. And they'll say, yes, I did. I absolutely did. No, you didn't. You used the word gospel about 10 times. You used the word grace about 10 times. But everybody out there hearing that they're not a church person, when they hear the word grace, they're saying, yeah, God's just a really good guy. Boys will be boys. He sweeps it under the rug. He's just a really decent guy. There's no sense of the cross and justification and that kind of thing that has ever come through. And there's not really an engagement with the unbeliever about, now you might be thinking this. Your reaction might be that. And you need to ultimately see how everything is going to drive us to the foot of the cross. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of preaching that we really don't see very much, because we're so used to our audience being able to connect all the dots and know what we're talking about when we use certain words.
So, and if I can agree with you and carry that baton a little further down the track on another component in our denomination, this is going to tie back to the need for character and what I would say is courage, because when you do that, your sermons are not going to sound like sermons that are preached in established churches.
That's right.
And the doctrinaire, hypercritical, suspicious nature of where our culture is right now, even in the PCA, some quarters of the PCA are going to listen to your sermons and then conclude you're not orthodox.
Right.
Because you don't preach a doctrinal treatise every week that sounds like what their sermons sound like. And that is happening. And so that church planter needs to have some courage, because he's got to be able to know what Ted just said, do what Ted just said, but also believe in it in such that he can withstand the critiques that come his way when people in the presbytery say, well, how come you never, you don't do, how come they see the difference, and they don't react to that difference with respect. They react to that difference with criticism and suspicion.
Right, because it's different than from what they've been used to. And
a church established for Christians in Christendom looks and sounds away. A church plant connecting with unchurched non-Christians might as well be in French or Russian, because it's got a completely different culture and language than that established church that's very PCA traditional for Christians. And that church might be reaching some people. It might. I don't know how many conversions they're seeing, unless they're covenant children coming to faith, which is not evil. But if we're talking about reaching the lost, those established churches that are communicating for Christians by Christians, it's field of dreams. Build it and they'll come. Build a church for Christians. Christians will come to it. Build a church for unchurched non-Christians are welcome, and they'll come also.
But that takes training, and it takes with that humility.
Yes.
And one of my own examples, when I moved here to Chicago 12 years ago, one of the churches we planted was on the west side of Chicago. And the target were gangbangers, ex-cons, prostitutes, drug addicts. And we still have this going. I still preach at it once a month, now virtually thing. But for me, I had to make major changes in how I preached to connect with that group. And so what we did was, for me and a couple of others, we set up a panel. We actually invited a couple of dozen people off the street, bought their lunch, and said, while you eat your lunch, I'm going to preach a 10-minute message, and I want you to give me feedback on it. And I would start preaching, and they'd stop me 2 minutes in and go, man, I don't even know what you're talking about. What are those words that you're using? And then I would start, preaching again. They say, man, where's your emotion? If you don't, this doesn't move you, why should it move me? If you don't believe it, why should I believe it? I mean, we did this for like 6 weeks. And it was a very humbling experience. And other times I'd be trying to change and they'd say, oh man, now you're trying to sound black and it's embarrassing. Just stop it. Okay. We just did all of that. But then I really learned a different way to connect with them. Mm-hmm. And 10 years later, it's going really, really well. Mm-hmm. So we have to be perpetual learners and allow ourselves to say, I got to make some significant changes if I'm going to do what John Stott said to do so many years ago. Our job is to bridge two worlds. Mm-hmm. Do you understand the scriptures, but do you understand the world in which you're seeking to preach, to connect with people? And you've got to be able to build those bridges relationally and in your preaching.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, this is really helpful, and I'm getting discouraged because I was kind of hoping, I could take a class here or there and then go plant a church. It's sounding like this idea of training is pulling it much further back and earlier. Let's talk about that, because again, in our quick fix culture, it is okay. I've got a call to do this. I've got all the equipment. What else do I need? Just could you email me a few articles to read and I'll go do it. So let's talk about how can we begin this process earlier than post seminary, a couple years after ordained, now go plant a church. How can we be preparing and training planters years, decades ahead?
Yeah, we going back to the long view, we are actually talking with our high school students about the potential of how many of them will either be church planters, leaders in a church plant, core group members, etc. We're talking to our high school kids, recognizing that you got to start when they're teenagers to get them ready by the time they're 30. And we really, so our partnership with Campus Outreach, so that our student ministries up to high school graduation is handing a baton to our Campus Outreach staff members. And that's who we partner with it locally. And we have a Campus Outreach ministry we host to reach local college campuses, and that there is a baton they're carrying. And then we're thinking about what does, discipleship look like, internships and residency programs look like on the way to seminary and then church planting. We're taking that long of a view.
So talk a little bit about, you had mentioned before we went on, partnering with Strong Tower,
Right.
sister church, and an internship program, which is before seminary.
Right. We planted Strong Tower in 2014, and the guy that planted it had been a college student locally. And he came to our church. He was a new convert when he went to college. He got plugged into our church while he was in college, got plugged into a community development ministry with an at-risk neighborhood. And then he is a white man married to a black girl. And they had a heart for at-risk neighborhoods and racial issues. So we quickly had to say, look, we're not pros. We'll help, we'll support, we'll encourage. Well, we folded him into kind of a long track of discipleship. And then we bridged him to RTS Orlando and helped him pay for seminary and basically let him work while he was doing seminary. And now that young man is saying, we need to formalize and make that official to say we're going to have a bridge between college and the seminary track to say we're going to fund a 2-year residency plan to try to get some of that training. But a lot of it, recognize, absorb the culture. Just absorb the DNA. Listen, breathe, notice, watch, learn, but get in almost like in a way of living kind of culture on the way to reproductive ministry.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, there was a question that came up. How do you train a planter to do evangelism? And I'm thinking of your answer there, and it's kind of sounding like if you have to train a planter to do evangelism, you might be a little too late.
You might not be a church planter.
So in the context of what you're describing, how is it, for example, how is evangelism brought into that, so that it might just back up, because my kind of somewhat snide thinking when it comes to evangelism is, why would we send somebody to seminary if they've not been doing evangelism? The last thing I want to do is, you haven't been doing evangelism, now you got your theology, you're going to be less useful in that context. If you have evangelism as your base, then that theology philosophy.
Provocative when I heard it 30 years ago, because it was 1991. I remember hearing at seminary that in Korea, there were certain quarters of Korea, they wouldn't let you go to seminary until you had already planted a church. Now imagine that in America. That would empty the seminaries. And then what would happen is all the seminaries would cry foul because they'd lose all their income, because they wouldn't have so many students. Because can you imagine that requirement? You have to plant a church before you go to seminary. And so there is, I think there is a recognition that seminary is not necessarily the place to learn evangelism. We've tried to think of it as evangelistic culture. So if everything we do is evangelistic, so this is going back also back to the 90s when I was privileged to do some training with Tim Keller and Dick Hoffman. And one of the things they just said about the way they thought at Redeemer was, and this was in the early days before they were really famous, they just said, we conduct every meeting as if a hostile member, unbelieving member of the liberal press was sitting in the room. Every meeting we do, a staff meeting, a worship debrief meeting, everything we do it as if a critical non-Christian is sitting in the room. And what does that train you to do? You're thinking constantly about, how is this going to sound to the outsider? Well, that is a state of mind that takes unbelievable stamina to maintain. But we really have tried to take that to heart to say, what does it mean that church, we assume non-Christians are in the room? Everywhere, every small group, we assume non-Christians are in the small groups. So it kind of is, the hope is we're conveying a respect for, but also a hope for a non-Christian, because the same hope I have is the hope I have for them. And they're not a sinner and I'm righteous. No, I'm a sinner and Jesus is merciful. And if he can reach all the way out to Mars to save me, I'm sure he can reach the planet Earth where they are to save them. So there's a sensibility about just that ties it all the way back to that gospel fluency. Do I live like I'm in need of Jesus today? Mm. And then now, do I communicate out of that hope?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. So, keeping along that same line of thinking, talking about opportunities for the people that are listening, what are some of the opportunities they would have now to be able to get training?
Well, one of the things that we've begun to provide is what I call just foundations in church planting. That's a 48-hour event, pulling people together. And I do this around the Midwest in different locations, Lexington, Kentucky, Lincoln, Nebraska, whatever. And we keep them small, interactive, geographically accessible. It also allows us to distance during COVID season as well, but we will do it the same way anyway. And what we try to do is do that initial orientation to church planting, the key principles, dynamics, big picture, all the kind of stuff. And then those who want to, depending on where they're at, can then sign up for a coaching segment with a cohort of other people who are at the same stage of church planting development with their own plant. Then we'll do another webinar that's coming up next month, one on launching. For example, how to launch in a meaningful way. This is a strategic stage in the development of your church. You want to maximize its potential because it's not just an event, it's months before and months after that you really want to maximize that. Without training, you wouldn't even think in those terms. You'd think, let's just get this thing, find a place, and let's just get going. And then after that webinar is done, that's just an hour and a half, you can get another coaching cohort and do that for the next 3 or 4 months, coaching you through your launch. And then the next one is in developing your church plant, part 1, then more coaching, developing your church plant, part 2, particularizing, you're training your elders and particularizing your church, positioning your church to reproduce itself. All of these are stages along the way. You build seeds in for even the later ones early on and develop them, but you spread this out over a period of 3 years, and it's far more timely, I think, for people, bite-sized so they can absorb it and apply it more effectively in the context of a coaching cohort or individual coaching, depending on what's available. Now, with those segments spread out over those years, we build in the next gen, which has the soft skills, so that people then in between these things are getting some of the soft skill development, even like how to run a meeting, how to manage your time, just all sorts of things like that that you probably don't get in a seminary or more formal training context, but are really critical to your ability to function well in a ministry context. So we kind of have laid that all out. And so those are the various opportunities we have. So the next one we have will be at Redeemer Presbyterian Church in November. We're just going to let the COVID thing get done with, get through summer. And so the next one will just be in November. Redeemer Presbyterian in Indianapolis will be hosting that. So that's how we've laid out the more formal training process, but it's integral. It's got to be wedded with coaching, because otherwise it's just stuff that is so hard to translate into your own context.
So it sounds like we were talking about long picture. You're spacing it out,
right?
So you can integrate while you're doing, but it's also not just teacher to student. Here's the information, go do it. It's interactive. Talk about coaching a cohort, real time, and in some ways it's sounding somewhat, to a certain degree, a cultural connectedness, because planting is not the same universally. It does depend on who you are and where you're at.
But the advantage of a cohort is that,
and who's with you in your team.
There you go. Yeah. And the advantage of a cohort is you get to play off each other and hear what each other is dealing with, positively and negative ideas. It just becomes an idea playground almost. And if you're struggling with things, it's a place to go as well. So I think that is so very important. Now, you talked about the development thing. I was going to throw into that too. One of the things we've worked on is, and I think presbyteries all over the country can do, is develop a pipeline and to invest, have a very intentional plan to invest in the development of future leaders in your presbytery or your church. And so one of the things I've worked with presbyteries is to identify their pipeline. Make a list of all the people in your presbytery that you think could be future planters. It could be assistant pastors. It could be college ministry staff of all stripes. It could be seminary students. It could be young leaders emerging out of a college ministry. I mean, make a list, and then we form a team, a leadership development team. We've done this in Great Lakes, Central Indiana, Chicago Metro, whatsoever. You form a team, and their only job is to walk with these guys. Walk with them down the path. Get to know them. Begin to mentor them. Find out what they need. Do they need more? They're doing great experience, even in evangelism. Let's say a CO guy, but they don't have much theological training. Okay, we got to move down that path. Somebody else is getting great theological training, but they're not getting the development of this kind of skills or the experience we want them to have. So how are we going to get them that? How do we get them plugged into situations and get the kind of training that they're going to need to move down the path? And part of that is for them discovering, well, what is God calling me to? How do I work through the issues of calling even and figure all that out? It could be a messy process. So if you have teams that are working with guys along this line, it can really help you lay the groundwork way before they get into their long-term ministry context to build in the things that they're going to need.
Can I offer an analogy?
Yeah.
There's commonality. So take every team in the major league right now. There's commonality of skills: hitting, pitching, fielding, running. Okay, commonality. Every organization has their own tailored system. Right. Now, there's even commonalities there. There's scouting to single A to double A to triple A to majors. But notice that every club has their own little tailored approach to how they're going to discover talent and move them. Right. But I think exactly what you said, Ted, is that every one of those organizations has some kind of system they figured out. We know how to encourage the strength and build into the weakness. Yeah. And that's what we got to do.
And this is where the readiness seminars for us come in very handy. The Church Planter Readiness Seminar, which for years with Jim Hatch, we've done at the various seminaries, but now we're doing it almost presbytery by presbytery. We're going to have a Central Indiana Readiness Seminar in the fall. Then right after that, a Michigan Readiness Seminar. And what it is, that's designed for young men who are asking, should church planting be on my radar? Is this something I ought to be thinking about? What's really involved in that? What are the basics of a church planter? What do you actually have to do? So this gives them that initial orientation. You have this Friday night and Saturday together in like a little tiny miniature version of an assessment center kind of thing. And then out of that, you get feedback and say, okay, if this is the path, we'll give you a sense of real strong, medium, or, don't call us, we'll call you, whatever. And then we say, these are things you need to work on. If you're going to be moving down the path church planting, these are the competencies or other areas of your life to be working on. So let's come alongside you. This gives us an objective evaluation, something we can work on. Then later on, you'll go to the assessment center, a far more intense and thoroughgoing analysis. Out of that, you may come say, okay, this is great. You're looking wonderful, but now let's work on these 4 things. And then eventually into internships, into an apprenticeship, and out you come planting. It's based on training, experience, assessments all along the way. And this kind of long-term investment, I think, produces the kind of people, we have much better chance of seeing the kind of people we want emerging into the mission field.
So to go to a readiness seminar, you're not already committing to be a church planter. It's a discerning process.
Yep. It's part of the early on discerning process. Should I be thinking about this? And if so, if I want to even just explore it, what do I need to do?
Right. Oh, good. And there's one going to be over at RTS Orlando, I believe, in September, October.
Yeah. There was just one at Covenant Seminary.
Yeah.
You have those at RTS. You have the ones coming up this fall in the Midwest as well. Yeah.
And they really are. I would just encourage anyone listening, since it's a discerning process, it's one of the best things you can figure out. Look, you're skilled and gifted by God. There is call and there's character. There are competencies, but I think a parish context will suit you best. That's great news. So think about church planting. And so as you go through those, then there are other opportunities as well after the readiness seminar. Ted, you're going to be offering a virtual summer internship. Why don't you talk about that?
Oh, yeah. We had to do it last year because of COVID. M&A, Jim Hatch, have typically run a summer internship program where those who've come through the readiness seminar, gotten a certain level of rating, are then matched, if they're able and willing, into an internship, into a church plant somewhere. It could be nearby, it could be cross country. We've got all sorts of opportunities, but you go land in that church plant. You're an asset to that plant. You'll preach once or twice. You'll give the church planter a break that he might not get otherwise. And you hopefully just catch the church planting bug and do this for 8 or 10 weeks. Then come back to seminary or wherever else that you are at that point in time. So we couldn't do those in-persons last year, so we pivoted and did a virtual. So what we did was we had 8 weeks where I was just doing orientation sorts of things to church planting. What's involved, who's a planter, all this kind of thing. And then we interviewed like a half a dozen different church planters at different stages and different contexts, that kind of thing, implemented some of the next gen material. And it really went very, very well. And the feedback we got was, guys, whether we do in-person or not, I mean, in-person is great. We want to do that, but we should really do the virtual no matter what. It's just such a helpful additional component. So we're going to do it again this summer. Hopefully we'll have more guys doing in-person internships where we got plenty of places for them, but we will still run the virtual for 8 weeks starting the last week of May.
I'll be sending out the information on that after the webcast tonight when I send everything out. And there were people with the virtual, because it was virtual, that weren't from the Midwest. We had 2 guys from the Orlando area join us.
Right.
So there are opportunities all around.
Right. So it did seem to go really well. So we'll be doing that again this summer.
What in the time we have remaining, what are the other aspects that we should be thinking about when it comes to planting and training planters? Maybe I'd ask the question this way. The 3 of us, it was in a world far, far away when we planted our churches. times, as we said, have changed. What would you say that you wish you had then that you see happening now when it comes to training church planters?
Hmm.
Wow.
What do I wish we had? Well, I
There,
don't.
there was not a whole lot of training going on other
No, there
than
wasn't.
a cassette
Right.
tape to listen to. If you had more money, you could do a VHS, I guess. But you know,
What's that?
there wasn't quite much. There wasn't much there.
Yeah, it's funny because the old Global Church Advancement Conference was it was a drink from a fire hose. It really was. But there were so many practical exercises that Steve Childers organized that I took all my church planting apprentices through it.
Yeah.
But I think also it's funny to think it was a valuable thing, but I don't know if that would work today. Because I think we're back to that, what Ted had said. It's just that the customized organic nature of so many communities. Again, I think there's that common thread of experience competencies anybody needs for ministry. There's the additional layer of what a church planter needs, but then there's your context. And there's just no way to formalize that or predict it. Mm-hmm. And then you don't know what God's going to give you by way of opportunities. You don't know who God's going to raise up to be in your team with you that brings a whole new component to the recipe. And so, yeah, I think I do miss the old GCA conference.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I think one thing that that is now part of training that I wish I'd had more of back then is really a focus on team building. Mm-hmm. I mean, I really kind of poured myself into it, almost like this all depends on me. And I have to do all these things. Right. Whereas I think now, based on realizing in practical ways that was not a good idea, helping guys understand because in a church, you're inheriting an awful lot of leadership, for better or for worse. You're inheriting structures and programs and policies and people when you go into established church. But when you're planting a church, you got to create all of that. And I don't know that I had much training or experience in that at all. Mm-hmm. And I think, how do I begin to identify the people who really are going to be my future leadership? How do I meaningfully invest in them? How do I help build a team around them that's going to take on significant ministry responsibilities? How do I do this in a way that I can encourage them and ministry can be done well and I can equip them, and yet I'm not going to micromanage them either at the same time? And do I even understand then what's involved in all these different aspects of ministry? Even setting up for Sunday morning. That's why we have a whole launch webinar that's coming up, because there's so much that goes on Sunday mornings, everything related to the service itself, to the preaching and the music and the worship and the liturgy and who's going to do what and who's going to have communion. And then there's the operations aspect. Well, what about nursery and what about setup and takedown and it just goes on and on. And so there's like all this stuff that was already in place in the other churches I'd been a part of. Now I had to actually create it. And that's a real challenge. And I can only do that with a team or you'll burn that. So how do I build and develop a team that will do all of this and do it well with me?
Yeah, the mantra I've been repeating quite often, because I've felt and experienced it myself, is especially for my generation, that spiritual maturity was measured by self-sufficiency.
Right.
I can do it myself, I'm better off. But the good news is I think we're seeing more and more spiritual maturity is interdependency. It's much more about relationships.
That's well put, Chris.
That takes so much effort and time, but that is really what we're called to be and to do. In the end, it really ends up there. Well, guys, thank you so much. Appreciate your time and the questions listed on there in the chat box, but I'll be sending it out later. The link for this webinar will be sent to you. You can share it with someone else, but other information as well. But information from the Midwest Alliance, Renew Polk, from the Florida Church Planting Network. Next week we'll be talking, and it's somewhat related, but the growth and development of networks and how they can be part of this whole movement. Have been historically, where they're at now. they, like everything else, they've changed, and a lot of the change, it's exciting to see what's taking place. But appreciate your time, guys, and we'll be back on next week with talking to Larry Hoop with the By Faith article he's written on networks, along with Drew Bennett, who's another one of the guys from Central Florida there,
Right.
from Winter Haven, and Paul Hahn, who helped start the Southwest Church Planting Network and was previous coordinator of M&A. Well, until then, Lord bless. We'll talk later. Bye.